Hello and welcome to Sensei Podcast. This is Manos Brilakis discussing with leaders in the field of CTO and complex PCI. Sensei means teacher or master in Japanese. The goal of the Sensei Podcast is to help you learn and improve in CTO and complex PCI so that you can become the best that you can be and offer your patients the best possible results. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sensei Podcast. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. James Spratt from St. George's Hospital in London, one of the fathers of CTO PCI in Europe and around the world. Tremendous influence on the early development of techniques, on the educational part with an amazing book and cases. James, thank you so much for being part of the Sensei Podcast.
No, pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. I almost had to look up what Sensei meant, but I did remember, honestly.
Well, I had to look it up too, but I guess that means the master, the teacher, which is perfect from what you're doing.
Well, that's kind.
So James, tell me a little bit, how did it start for you? I know you've done a lot of work from the very early days of CTO PCI, but what gave you the inspiration and how were your early days of doing this?
Yeah, I think, Manos, it was just down to patient need. I started sort of as a consultant almost 20 years ago. That's when you're fully qualified, allegedly, in the UK. So about 20 years next year. And there wasn't really a lot of sort of systematized way of thinking about things. It's just if it was straightforward, we tended to treat it interventionally. And if it wasn't straightforward, we either sent it to surgery or we said that it didn't need treatment. And that always just didn't make sense to me, really. That why would it not need treatment just because it's hard to treat? So it was partly that patient need. You could see these patients frustrated and limited in their life and not given a lot of hope or opportunity. Partly that, and if I'm totally honest, partly because it was a challenge and probably says something deep-rootedly bad about me internally, that I've always liked the challenge, and it seemed that if it couldn't be done, that seemed like a good opportunity to prove them wrong, really.
But then from having the need to actually find the solution, there is some process there. So how was your process? How did you actually learn to do this procedure?
Yeah, I think the biggest, there is no shortcuts to mastery of anything. I think that's the first thing to say. And in this social media friendly world, we're always looking for a hack or a shortcut or, some sort of 3 words of wisdom that will give you the pathway that somebody else took a long time to master. And I think actually, if you look at anyone who's expert in their field, they first of all, they're immersed in the problem. The problem means something to them beyond being a job. And there's a need to want to master the problem. So that's a good place to start. If you're talking about externally in terms of what resources were available, well, as you well know, there were none. There were no resources at all. The only resource that we had, the most valuable resource, was that of our colleagues. So again, that was a bit different at the time. There was more of a, well, I'll do what I want to do, and I don't want to share it with my colleagues. Actually, the one thing that CTO has done very well is broken down a lot of those barriers. So we didn't view learning as competitive. In other words, obviously everybody wanted to be better, but it wasn't better at the expense of our friends and our colleagues. So when I started, I think the biggest thing I did well was to collaborate with people who shared the same goals. And at that time, that was, Colm and Simon, who are working sort of in a different country, actually, at the time. But we clearly had the fairly similar drive and similar ambition to improve. And then after industry sort of woke up, then it became easier to connect the dots to beyond your immediate country to, well, primarily the US. We formed strong bonds with the early innovators there and a lot of cross-working. So, I think at this stage, even in environments where there's a headline inventor, the true reality behind the scene is that there's a mesh or a network of people who have collaborated to get to that point, even if it's in increments. And I think this is a good environment which evidences that.
And then you've been instrumental yourself in actually teaching this to other people. And I always refer to your book and your figures. They're always the most clear ones, not just in CTO, but I would say the whole cardiology. That's very, very to the point. One picture really makes the point excellent. How do you come up with this? And how did you start the idea of educating people through that? And how do you make them so good?
Well, I mean, those are kind comments. And again, it probably reflects back to my previous comments with it's a team really behind it. And that particular journey, the educational journey, was started with the frustration that there wasn't any resources available. You know, the innovators in the early stages of CTO were the Japanese, and just the culture, you know, Sensei, that master, that culture is really not particularly a collaborative culture. It's certainly one of master and servant, and the servant spends his years watching the master, and only after a period of time, which is determined as much by time as expertise, does he transition to the sensei. So the sharing of information, that democratization, isn't something which is, you know, germane to that culture. And also clearly the language barriers as well. So there was a frustration there that the resources weren't available. So I set out to deconstruct the problem, and actually had the fortune of meeting Adrian Brown at the time, who's non-medical and had moved into industries in distribution and had a background in creative design. And we just spent basically hours trying to make the problem as simple as possible. He drew them, I explained them, reiterated back and forth that way. And that's where we started, just working at my kitchen table, trying to make sense of what looked insensible at the time, and sort of it developed from there. And, you know, you can see the evolution of Optima really has been upside down. You know, there was no commercial plan. It was just, let's solve this difficult, pointless problem, which almost nobody is engaged with. So the opposite of what a business plan would do. So, but driven by curiosity, patient level need, and actually the ability to communicate this information in a way that people could put it into action.
And then how have things evolved for you for now? You've taught many people. Do you feel that you've reached the pinnacle? You now are pretty comfortable with pretty much everything, at least you seem so. Or do you still get nervous in the cases? Are there some things that stress you out? How do you approach the cases now after all these years of work in the area?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really get nervous in cases. I never really have. I'm quite a high energy person, and I wouldn't say I'm very calm outside cases, but inside cases, I'm pretty calm. I mean, that can change. Obviously, everybody's subject to the same human frailties. I would say that if I was to give advice about, you know, how to improve in cases, it's define your environment. If your environment is secure, you can build on that, so you can solve problems and all the rest of it. I would say where I am now with my career, it's less about proving you can do stuff and more about defining a very hard edge of what's safe, and understanding that there isn't any prizes for pushing past safety, you know, and defining a success as something which doesn't matter to a patient. So, you know, there are elective procedures, and, you know, if there's envelopes to be pushed, I think they can be done in a relatively safe way, but at the same time, it's not theatre, it's not showboating. These are patients' lives, so we don't try to take as little chance with that as we can. But technically, I think we have slowed down quite a lot. I think there hasn't been the same technical evolution that we saw, you know, 5 to 8 years ago. That slowed a lot. But I suspect that you go through cycles, and perhaps the next innovation is around the corner.
And then when it comes to people you train, your fellows, people you choose to train, is there something you look for in these people? Is it their attitude, their skills? How do you decide who you're going to train and make them a good CTO or complex operator?
Yeah, that's a pretty easy question, really. I mean, nobody's born with skills. And actually, technical skills can be taught to a degree, but it's very difficult sometimes before people start to understand how good they can get. But they can certainly get a lot better than they are, and a lot better than most of our peer group. So curiosity is good. I like people who are hardworking, who aren't particularly conventional in how they address problems. I like lateral thinkers, people who are prepared to say, well, okay, let me question this. I like that attitude, and people who are prepared to go the extra mile. So, again, if we could think back to how you get to mastery, you have to be immersed in it. You have to be passionate about it. You have to put the effort in as well. There isn't a shortcut to getting good at anything.
And then how long does it take these days? I know it's been a different evolution now with the resources we have now, but how long do you think it takes to become a master?
I think it takes a long time still, Manos. I think, it's great to have ambition as a fellow and think I'm going to go do a complex fellowship with somebody good, and at the end of the year I'll be doing, I'll be at his or her level. I don't think that's achievable, to be honest. I think you're talking about a minimum pathway for CTO currently of 5 years with proper volume and proper support. And that's why, we still can get better, because that's tough ask, particularly given that there isn't a massive reward at the end of the rainbow. It's just more of the same. So, I think when you get back to who you're selecting, that passion is really important, because it will take you through the dark times where you think, I'm never going to get better. Everybody experiences those. You just have to keep the faith and keep working hard and understand why you got into it in the first place, and just work towards those goals.
So when you do something else, let's say piano, whatever instrument, then you can practice harder songs. And the problem with CTO or complex is that the patient comes to you, and yes, you can send him out or send for the proctor, but you don't have really much control about who comes to you and what they have. So how do you deal with this when you teach people? Do you have them just not do the complex cases, do the simple cases? How does that work?
Yeah, but I guess if we ask ourselves what makes cases complex, it's rarely one discrete element. It's more the summation of elements. And part of it is cognitive burnout. You're constantly making decisions or guesses. And after a while, you just kind of think you've got cognitive fatigue, or you've got physical fatigue, or you get into an emotional state that accelerates one of the two states. So, I think as a proctor, what you can do is, first of all, take the emotion away. Second of all, you can definitely lower the cognitive fatigue. And when it comes to the technical challenges, you can take people past those points and say, well, let me do this, and then we'll let you back in. And actually, that's a good way to get them exposed to trying stuff they haven't tried before. Because as you say, the big challenge we have, because it's all in vivo, is how do you do that safely? How do you not jeopardize the patient's safety, which is really, really important. So I think if you really want to accelerate training, you'd have to take a lot of those moments into an ex vivo environment, more out of the body experiences in a technical way rather than a kind of psychedelic way.
Perfect. And then in terms of the teaching the different points, which aspect do you think is the most challenging to teach? Is it microcatheters, wires, the thinking process? What do you find the hardest thing to impart to new operators about the CTO PCI process?
I think it's human biases is what make people difficult to treat. So like the kind of ideas stick to them like flies in flypaper, and they're very difficult to remove. And we love our biases, and okay, you're never going to change that to a degree. But I think a classic example is that interface between engineering and interventional cardiology, whereas engineers, as a rule, and I'm generalizing here, are very proactive. They're planners. They measure things. They make decisions based on, experiments, whereas interventional cardiologists are very reactive and quite often emotionally driven on things like touch and feel, which is our surrogate markers for the pressure measurements that the engineers make. So I think there is definitely a sweet spot in the middle between those two where we can try and meld the best of both worlds. We can explain the rationale behind choices, and then you can still develop your favorites within subsets. But I like to give people learning scaffolds. This is a framework for learning. You can still be you within this framework, but this is going to give you the best opportunity to get the best out of your equipment.
You said before that taking things ex vivo is a good way to do it, which I agree, but the models currently have limitations. There's the Ethos model, the Asahi, there's some other models. So which models do you currently use, if you use any, for your for training? And I know in your course as well, you had a lot of skills and hand skills operations. So which ones do you find the most useful in terms of ex vivo models?
Yeah, I agree that there are limitations to all of them. And I'm not sure, I would have a favorite per se. For example, in Optima Fellows, we had 14 different workstations. I think what we did differently was we tried to focus on the why, the clinical problem behind, rather than just highlight what a piece of equipment can do. Because I think that's where you get into the favoritism and I like this because it did that, and this kind of micro experience. People just reference what the last case did or the case before that. I had good experience with that, so I'm going to do that again. But it just gives them a broader framework for learning. But I think, that kind of teaching is definitely the way forward, because again, it reinforces the bonds between mentor and mentee. It also tightens the communication with industry. An industry needs to be part of the conversation, whether we like it or not. And it gives people an opportunity to experience a lot of different microenvironments, which would otherwise probably take months to learn. It'll accelerate their learning for sure.
Now, James, on the many things that you are doing and you've done over the years, which ones are you most proud of?
Yeah, I don't really reflect too much on the past. I think it's probably dangerous to be too kind of proud and so on. I don't think that's something that I would aspire to. I think I would say if I look at my former self, I can predict what I would have said. I'm quite predictable that way. I pretty much always give my best when I agree to do something. I'm pretty reliable that way, and I'm pretty well motivated. And I think those kind of high level characteristics, if you like, are more important than certificates and things like that, which are just external validation. So I'm a little bit stoic in that philosophy that when people are cheering, probably take it with a pinch of salt. And with their booing, take it with a pinch of salt. The world will do what it'll do. I think you can control yourself. You can't control the world. So I'm not too fussed by whether I'm in, in the good books or the bad books. I'm just going to follow my path.
No, but I'm not saying about what the other people think about yourself. What do you think was the best thing that you've done so far?
Well, I think I haven't taken any shortcuts, and I put the hard yards in, and I've done it for the right reasons in the right environment. And I think I'm, reasonably pleased with that. I've got a few lucky breaks, and, I've still got my health and all those kinds of things. So, yeah, still kicking, as they say, Manos.
And pretty good, if I can say so. So how do you get to that health kicking? I mean, do you exercise? Do you do some things to keep your brain active? How do you keep in, because as you say, some cases can be long, can be difficult. How do you keep fit for all this, mentally and your body?
I'm afraid I'm pretty obsessed when it comes to health and fitness. So I'm obsessive with diet. I'm obsessive with exercise, do a lot of exercise. I'm obsessive with sleep. I monitor my sleep. I monitor my blood glucose. I monitor my blood pressure. Everything gets checked. I'm one of these health nuts, I'm afraid. So, and I don't think there are any shortcuts. As people always tell you, you've got one life and it's pretty short. And I don't really have any desire to have it any shorter. I'd rather have it slightly longer, and I'd rather be able to do the things that I enjoy doing for longer. So I know, like yourself, you put a lot of effort into keeping fit. So I do it, but I don't actually see it as effort. I actually really enjoy it. I've always been a kind of competitive. I used to swim competitively when I was younger, and now I cycle and snowboard and do weights and still swim, and lots of stuff really.
Isn't snowboarding a little dangerous for a CTO operator?
No, the more dangerous the better. I like the danger. Cliffs.
Well, no surprise. I guess you're applying your lessons for CTO into your personal life as well. Assess everything, keep everything planned carefully, so you don't have to. So you superior skill, I guess. So that's awesome.
Don't look down.
So, what is your favorite book and your favorite movie?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a tough one. I should have done the research, shouldn't I? I mean, I read a lot of books, so you can see that's my bookshelf. So I read a lot of books. What would my favorite be? Well, I mean, as a novelist, Graham Greene would probably be up there. He's a kind of English novelist from the sort of 50s to the 80s. But I read a lot of nonfiction nowadays, a lot of science. I like the kind of science of consciousness, neuroscience, stuff like that, which sounds really boring. And favorite film? Well, the one I liked most recently was a Martin McDonagh film, and he did the In Bruges back in the day, and his latest film is called Banshees of Inishowen, which is with Brendan Gleeson and Colin Farrell, which was great.
But I think most CTO operators like the action film, so
no, this is not an action.
That's good.
It's kind of set in the west coast of Ireland, and it's sort of a dark comedy.
It's perfect. Now, how about what's the next step for you? What excites you the most for the future?
So, next step, I think, is to think about where can I make the biggest impact and where can I make the biggest impact educationally. So for me, that's in more standard PCI. So how can we get more imaging done? How can we treat calcium properly? How can we do bifurcations? Where drug-eluting balloons fit in? These kind of questions, really. And even beyond interventional cardiology, I have a big interest in metabolic medicine and advances in managing, dyslipidemia. Well, again, sounds very boring. Management of insulin resistance, all that kind of stuff I like on a sort of nerdy level. So, but educationally, I think that there's a pyramid that we start at the top with CTO PCI, the most technically complex, the most difficult patients. But if we want to shift the needle, I'd like to shift it to the right so that all operators get the access to the level of education so we can make the biggest impact to patient care. And I think, we've made some progress on that, but there's so much more to do that that's where I think I'll be focusing most of my energies.
Perfect. And then in terms of your yourself, I know you're pretty young, you do everything right, so you're going to stay for another 100 years probably, but what's your eventual plan? Are you going to be doing this when you're 80?
Well, that's a tough one. I think I'd like to have the opportunity to make a choice around that rather than have to do anything. I think my fitness and my health are they're top of the tree importance, and I'd like to spend maybe more time doing those things as I get older. But I do enjoy solving problems, and I do enjoy using my brain. So I couldn't see myself kind of just stopping altogether, in the conventional retirement sense. So I don't really have good answers to that, Manos, other than I'd like to still be involved in an intellectual capacity, but perhaps have more of the choices on my side as to where I'm going to spend my time rather than saying, right, you have to be here at Tuesday at 8 o'clock or whatever.
And then along the same lines, health is important. We all get a lot of radiation, especially with the number of cases you're doing and the complexity. The radiation might be an issue. Is that bothering you? Do you do anything special for that?
Yeah, and it's one of the areas we're working on educationally at the moment, actually. So yes, it bothers me a lot. Actually today is the 2-year anniversary that David Foley died. So close friend of ours with a left-sided brain tumor. one of the pivotal interventional cardiologists in Europe and globally, actually involved in the Thorax Center, all the early studies there. So that's a big thing for us. We're lucky now to have Rampart in place in St. George's, and actually I'm at the stage now, I'm just back from Bahrain last week, and they had Rampart in place there too, where I'm actually saying to people, if you want me to do a live case and you don't have adequate radiation exposure, then it's a no for me. So I do think that's it's going to be one of these topics that's got a long way to run, and awareness is just starting to wake up. So I think it's going to be a hot topic over the next, several years, and I certainly hope to contribute that to raise awareness and to point us towards more durable solutions.
And you're comfortable, you get the good enough protection without lead and using the system?
Well, it's a barrier, and it works if it works. So you have to pair it with live monitoring, and you have to pair it with expertise. So our radiographer has the live monitoring there. If we move the cameras and a little gap appears, you see that almost immediately. So you get a flag when you step on the pedal, and that can be improved. So I think we're seeing 99% plus reduction in backscatter radiation. So, and it's actually quite a few cases, even cases with screening times, 30, 40 minutes, where you can come out with no microsievers, 0 dose. So that's a game changer anyway. You kind of cut it or dice it. It can be improved, of course, and I'm sure it will be improved or iterated, but you're already at a scenario where you're measuring live, which most people don't do, and you're attenuating significantly, which most people don't do. I still wear LEDs because we kind of have to in the UK. It's part of the regulations. But I think in the absence of proper data to support not wearing LEDs, I'm going to continue to do so, but make them light LEDs. I don't wear the leg ones anymore. I don't wear any glasses. And it makes a big difference. I did a complex procedure in Bahrain on Friday. And the one thing I did notice is that actually normally you come out of these procedures drained, just exhausted, even though I'm pretty fit. Now that was all gone. I was, totally fine, almost no tiredness at all. So I think there are metabolic damage happening at a cellular level when we're exposed to significant backscatter, and we pay a physiological cost for that. And clearly over time, we think of it sometimes as just something that may happen in the future. But what we forget is that the cellular damage is happening all the time. A bit like when you smoke, your cellular damage happens. Some people may dodge the eventual bullet, but it still happens. So I think the radiation is similar in terms of its kind of physiological insult. And it probably explains why at the end of a tough day, you just feel broken. I remember many times back in the day, 3 or 4 CTOs, you just think, oh my goodness, I just don't have the energy to do anything now.
Well, I think most people attribute this to wearing the lead, but I guess, that what you're saying, the physiologic basis of direct cell damage, that's also could well be a big part of that.
Well, you can measure it, of course. You can measure the markers of DNA damage, but I wonder if you looked at, I don't know what the marker would be, IL-6 or something like that, you probably would see an activation in these kind of repair pathways as well.
Oh, absolutely. So, James, clearly you thought about these things much more than I would say, maybe not everyone, but the vast majority of interventionalists, including the expert interventionalists. So if you had to give as you say, you don't want to do that, but if you had to give like 2 or 3 or 4 pearls of wisdom, kind of high level for people who want to become experts at doing this, what would you tell them?
I think pick something that you feel there's a real value in doing, because you put all this effort in and you lift your head and it's been a complete waste of time. That's a pretty depressing place to be. So there is definitely a value which we don't often discuss in doing good things for other people, helping them. We undersell that. We talk about technical things a lot, but actually having a job where you're helping somebody, that's your job, to help them. is an incredible privilege. And we, particularly in the NHS, have to remind ourselves of that, Manos, because we don't have a stack of money that you boys have. So I would say that that's the first thing. You have to kind of get some sort of intrinsic pleasure of your work. And then you should take a pride in it, really. I think you should take a pride in anything you do. And I think if we were to learn anything from the title of your podcast, the Sensei podcast, the thing I like most about Japan is they take a pride in the small things. And small things matter, So, for example, the sushi masters, they spend years knowing how to cut fish. And they do it to a level where it turns from being a trivial thing to an art. And you see that in almost everything they do. They take a craft and they take it to its nth degree. And that gives you an incredible pleasure when you do that and bring that to your work. And different cultures have got different words for it. In French, they call it métier, and it's the joy of work. And I think actually, if you can take joy from your work in taking it to that level of expertise, and that's twinned with the fact you're actually doing it to help somebody else, it takes it from the selfish to the selfless, and that again is a great place to be. And I think that immersion alone will lead you to a lot of answers to the questions you've got. What do I do? The smart people work it out. Some people want it delivered on a plate, and if that's you're probably the wrong person for this game. Pick something easier.
Perfect. Well, that's to the point. You have to love it to succeed, and you have to work hard at it, which is so true.
You do.
Well, James, I know you have a flight to catch. I really appreciate you taking the time today. I think this will help myself and many other people in their journey. So thanks so much again for everything you've done, and excited to keep working with you.
Pleasure, Manos. Thanks for asking me, and great job with the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Sensei podcast.